Welcome to episode 192 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/192. 7 Health is currently taking on new clients, and there are a handful of reasons that clients commonly come and see us. Hypothalamic amenorrhea is probably the first one, and this is the fancy name for not getting a period. And this is often a result of undereating and over-exercising for what the body needs, irrespective of your actual size. And it's always coupled with body dissatisfaction and a fear of gaining weight. We work with clients along the disordered eating and eating disorder spectrum. And sometimes clients wouldn't think to use the term disordered eating to describe themselves, but they notice that they're overly restricted with their eating. They fear certain foods, whether that be bread or carbs or fat or processed foods. They feel compelled to exercise excessively, and or they find themselves binging or feeling out of control around food. There are clients then who want to move on from dieting. So they've had years or decades of doing so and realizing that it's just not working, but they're struggling to figure out how to do food without dieting. So what should they eat? How do they listen to their body? What will happen with their weight? They're confused and overwhelmed and just don't know where to start. And then the final one is body dissatisfaction and negative body image. For many clients, they experience feelings of body shame and hatred, and they find themselves fixated on weight and determined to be a particular size and frustrated with what they see in the mirror. And they may even avoid social events or opt out of photographs or put off appointments with doctors as a result of negative body thoughts. So in all of these areas, we're able to help and do so through a mix of understanding physiology and psychology. So understanding how the body works and how to support the physical body, but also being compassionate and uncovering the whys behind clients' behavior and figuring out ways that they can change this. So if any of these are areas you want help with, then please get in contact. You can head over to 7-health.com/help. And there you can read about how we work with clients and apply for a free initial chat. The address again is 7-health.com, and it will also be included in the show notes. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I am your host, Chris Sandel. So this week I am back with a solo episode. It's been a while since one of these has come out. I know I did a recent solo episode on coronavirus, but I'm talking more about the longer form solo episodes. And this is actually going to be a two-parter. So it's not a completely new episode, but is one of my second editions where I do a rewrite or a re-update of a previous episode that I've done. And this one is all about sleep. So the first edition of this episode was episode 17 and came out in November 2015, so roughly 4.5 years ago. But before I go any further, let me start with the book giveaway. So we are now giving away a book from our resources page with every episode, and the winner for this week is Dylan R. So Dylan, thank you for the review. We'll be in contact and sending you a book of your choosing. And reviews help increase the visibility of the podcast, and they enable us to reach and help more people. And they also give you a chance to win a book. So all you need to do is leave a review on iTunes, take a screenshot of it, and then email it to info@7-health.com, and then you'll permanently be entered into the draw. So back to the episode now. This has been an episode I've wanted to update for a long while now. I've been such a huge proponent of the importance of sleep, and it's something I'm always working on with clients. And in the last 4 years, there's been so much new information that I've learned that I want to be including in this second edition. There are a handful of sources that have had the biggest impact on me in terms of this new information. Most recently and most profoundly, it is Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep. And I know I've mentioned it a number of times on the podcast before, I think with Alan Flanagan and Elise Resch, and there's been other guests where I've referenced it. It was also one of my favorite books from 2019, and so it was in that episode where I cover all my favorite things at the end of the year. It was actually a book I'd been seeing for a number of years whenever I'd go near a WH Smith or I'd be in an airport or whatever, it seemed to always be sort of outward facing, and I'd see it and I just kept passing it by. And I finally got around to ordering it and reading it, and I'm really glad that I did. The other source that influenced my understanding around sleep is Ari Whitten and his Energy Blueprint program. So I've had Ari on the podcast a number of times in the early days of the show, and I have a lot of respect for Ari, although I'd say over the years our ideas have diverged and we're serving very different segments of the health space. But while we have plenty of areas of disagreement, I still continue to follow his work to see what he's up to and what he's focusing on. And the Energy Blueprint is Ari's flagship program, and it has a whole section on sleep. And when I first watched this, it would have been a number of years ago, there was a ton that I learned from it. And a lot of what I subsequently read in Walker's Why We Sleep book were ideas that I'd first heard Ari talk about. So those are probably the two biggest sources. There's also been some papers that I'm going to make reference to and we'll also link to in the show notes. Now, with previous episodes where I've done the second editions, it's been more of an update where the structure has stayed the same and I'm simply adding in new sections. Well, this is more like a complete rewrite. Like some of it has stayed the same, but rather than telling you, as I have in other second editions, of what's new information, just assume that it is all new. And this was going to be a single episode when I started working on it, but it just became apparent that this was going to be way too long for a single episode. I think it's one thing to have a conversation that is 2 hours or nearing 2 hours. It's another with me to be simply talking for that length of time where it can be quite dense information. So in this part one, I'm going to be looking at the mechanics around sleep. So what drives us to sleep? We'll look at circadian rhythm. I cover chronotypes and explaining what this is and how it changes through various life stages. I'll cover sleep health and how we define the term, and then finally look at what happens during sleep. So covering sleep cycles, REM versus non-REM sleep, and then the functions of sleep. So that's what we're going to cover in this one today, in part one. In part two, it's going to be all the recommendations based on this information. So if you want to just maximize the benefit of sleep, what can you be doing? And what I also want to do with that episode is highlight things that are especially relevant with the clients that I see, because context matters. And while there's lots of ideas and suggestions that were made in, say, Why We Sleep, this book is aimed at the general audience, talking to everyone in the population. And the vast majority of the clients that we're working with here are suffering with disordered eating, eating disorders, or chronic dieting. And this is often coupled with overexercise. So I want to make sure that I frame part two to take this into account, because if you have an eating disorder, for example, your reasons for poor sleep can be very different from the general population. And there will obviously be some overlap and things that are universal, but other issues are going to be more specific. And I want to make sure that I address this. And both with part one and part two, I don't want to fall into the trap of healthism around sleep. So to quote Lucy Affamore in terms of healthism, it is the belief system that sees health as the property and responsibility of the individual and ranks the personal pursuit of health above everything else. It ignores the impact of poverty, oppression, war, violence, luck, historical atrocities, abuse, and the environment, which includes traffic, pollution, clean water, etc. It protects the status quo, leads to victim blaming and privilege, increases health inequalities, and fosters internalized oppression. It judges people's worth according to their health. End quote. So someone's ability or lack thereof to get proper sleep is not completely within their control. So shift work may be associated with negative health consequences, but often people don't have a choice around this. And this is maybe the work that they need to do to put food on the table. Or they choose to do this work because they think it is valuable work, but by the nature of that job, they have to work night shift. So health isn't the only consideration when someone makes choices. And very often it is less about a choice and more about what has to be done. So everything I say in these 2 podcasts is looking at the state of what we know with science. It's not a moral imperative that you have to follow it. And so this is especially true when I get to part 2 of the podcast and we're addressing things that can be done to support proper sleep. See these simply as potential options. Some won't be options at all, like no matter how much you'd like them to be, they simply aren't on offer to you. And others will be options, and if you choose to, you can implement them. So that is an overview of these next 2 podcasts. To begin with, what I want to do is start by looking at our drive for sleep and the 2 systems that we have in our body that push us towards sleeping, and hopefully this means sleeping in a rhythmical and regular fashion. So the first system is described as sleep pressure or sleep-wake homeostasis. So homeostasis is the desire to find equilibrium, to create a stable internal state. And our body is trying to get the balance right between us being awake and us sleeping, as both of these are important for our health and for our survival. So if you are getting adequate sleep, when you wake up in the morning, you feel refreshed. And as the day goes on and you've had longer and longer time of being awake, your body starts to feel tired. And a big reason for this tiredness or sleep pressure is a substance called adenosine. So adenosine is a chemical substance that is produced in the body, and the longer time we spend awake, the more adenosine is built up. And adenosine has receptors in the brain, and as more of it hits the receptors, the more tired you get. So as the levels rise higher and higher, the more we have the desire or drive to find sleep. When we finally do sleep, part of the process that then occurs is the clearing and the breaking down of adenosine. So as sleep goes on, you have less and less of it. And by morning time, if things are as they should be, enough of the adenosine has been cleared so that when you wake up, you feel refreshed. And then you start that whole process again from day to night. So sleep pressure or tiredness, that tiredness feeling that we get after being awake for an increasing amount of time is partly down to adenosine buildup. So 2 things I should mention here. So one is to do with caffeine. So the way that caffeine works and why it helps people to feel less tired is it fights for the same receptor as the adenosine and it replaces it, or it sort of prevents the adenosine from locking onto the receptor. And this means that the adenosine is still continuing to build up in the background. You're just not noticing the physiological effects because of the caffeine. And that continues on until the caffeine is then broken down, and then you really notice how tired you are, which can then be experienced as a caffeine crash. The second thing is to do with sleep debt. So just like with credit cards, you can get into debt, you can get into debt with sleep. And meaning you have slept less than you need, and this lack of sleep is accruing just like a credit card. And adenosine is a big part of the reason for sleep debt. Now, as I'm going to talk about when we get onto the functions of sleep, there's a lot going on while we sleep. So a big part of the debt is also to do with repair that is being missed out on. But in terms of the feeling of being sleep deprived or still feeling unrefreshed after a good night's sleep or many good nights sleep, this is partly because of adenosine. So because of the sleep debt, the body's just not able to clear it as it should overnight. So when you wake up, there's still high enough amounts on the receptors that is then sending the message to your body to say you are still feeling tired. And this can be cleared with enough time and enough sleep so you get back to feeling refreshed on waking, but it takes time. And so let me just quote Walker on the topic of sleep debt. So the recycle rate of human beings is 16 hours. After 16 hours of being awake, the brain begins to fail. Humans need more than 7 hours a night to maintain cognitive function. After 10 days of just 7 hours sleep, the brain is as dysfunctional as it would be after going without sleep for 24 hours. 3 full nights of recovery sleep, i.e. more nights than a weekend, are insufficient to restore the performance back to normal levels after a week of short sleeping, end quote. So adenosine and sleep pressure are the first components of the drive towards sleep. And then the second component is circadian rhythm. So most people have heard the term circadian rhythm and know it as maybe the body clock or the patterns that occur across a day. And at different points of the day, different functions are going on, and these follow a daily structure. And this is obvious for things like, say, the wake and sleep cycles, but it also impacts on different organs and different body systems where they're doing different things at different points of the day. So how does circadian rhythm work? So in the brain, you have an area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. It is a tiny region of the brain in the hypothalamus, and it is basically your master clock. It is guiding your body. And scientists have actually found other circadian clocks around the body. So there is an article that I'm going to link to in the show notes where they found clocks in the liver and in the skin. But really, there are clocks in all tissues in our organs, and are a way for our organs and our systems to know what time it is and therefore what they should be doing. And in my original first edition of this podcast, I talked about circadian rhythm being impacted upon by light and dark cycles. And as humans, we have typically been awake during the daytime and asleep at nighttime. And this is down to the impact of light and circadian rhythm, which is true. And in this first episode, I gave the examples of cortisol and melatonin to show what happens across a 24-hour cycle, and because of how these hormones are connected to sleep and wake. So as the sun rises, the light stimulates the body to produce cortisol, which is released from your adrenal glands. And while cortisol is normally talked about as a stress hormone, it actually has lots of functions in the bodies. So in this instance, it can be thought about as an activating hormone, and it prepares the body for movement and work and other activity. And as your body's physiological systems developed a long time before fire and artificial light, the body works on the equation that light equals sunshine and then releases cortisol for daytime activities. So cortisol levels start to rise from sunrise, and then for the next 2 or 3 hours, peaking at around sort of 8 or 9 a.m. And then levels then drop slowly but remain decent enough until around midday. And then as the afternoon wears on, cortisol drops more significantly, and then especially the case as the sun goes down. And then as cortisol levels fall, your pineal gland begins to release melatonin. And melatonin is commonly known as the sleep hormone. It is released as light decreases. And this can explain why you may start to get tired in the middle of the winter at 4 p.m. if it's dark outside. And I like Walker's analogy for melatonin. He says melatonin is like the starting gun of a running race. It gets everyone to the start line, but it doesn't participate in the race. But through the secretions of melatonin, it helps other processes that then allow you to sleep. So secretion of melatonin continues to rise into the middle of the night, and then gradually starts to fall until morning time. And then once again, cortisol starts rising up, helping to pull you out of sleep to start the day, and that whole process starts again. So cortisol and melatonin are two hormones that follow a circadian pattern each day and impact on our desire and our drive to be either awake or to be sleeping. And so in the original episode, I really focused on how dependent the circadian rhythm is on the light-dark cycles, which is kind of true, but is not completely true. And this was actually one of the most fascinating experiments that Walker talked about in the book. And it was done in 1938 by two scientists, and they wanted to see what would happen to circadian rhythm if they were in complete darkness. So they lowered themselves into a cave that was so deep that there was no detectable light that could reach them. They lowered down beds and food and measuring devices with them, and then they stayed in complete darkness for 32 days. So what happened? Despite the complete lack of light, they followed a fairly predictable pattern where they would be awake for roughly 15 hours, followed by roughly 9 hours of sleep. So even without light, the body is still able to keep a circadian rhythm. But interestingly, without the presence of light, rather than keeping to a 24-hour rhythm, it was actually longer. So between 26 and 28 hours for one of the men, and then a bit over 24 hours for one of the others, which is actually where the name circadian rhythm comes from. It's a combination of two Latin words where circa means approximately and diem means daily, so approximately a day. Now, if our bodies were consistently following a circadian pattern of 26 or 28 hours, things would get pretty messy. Like, you'd no longer be following the 24 hours that it takes for the sun and the moon, and would get into periods of sleeping all day and being awake all night. And so this is where then the influence of light impacts on the circadian rhythm, and not just light, but many other factors. So eating and movement and temperature and a whole host of factors can impact on circadian rhythm. And these factors are called Zeitgebers, which comes from the German that means synchronizer or time giver. And it's these other factors that then help to reset or reinforce what time of day it is. So rather than your body working on a 26-hour cycle that it would be if it was in total darkness, it then keeps to a 24-hour cycle. And so it's these two systems, like the sleep pressure and the adenosine, and then the circadian rhythm, that are what help us and drive us towards being awake or being asleep. And one thing that Walker points out is that these systems, while often in sync, are actually completely separate to one another. Like, they're not interconnected at all. They don't talk to one another. And a good example of this is if you pull an all-nighter. So let's say you're studying for an exam and you stay up all night studying for the exam. And let's imagine that you manage to do this feat without the aid of caffeine. Typically at, say, 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., it's going to be super difficult to stay awake. Like, you're going to be feeling tired because of the high amounts of adenosine, and also because your circadian rhythm is telling you, like, this is when you are normally asleep. But then if you make it to 10 a.m., now you may start feeling less tired than where you were at 4 a.m. And if you were to actually take a nap at 10 a.m., it's unlikely you're going to sleep for the usual 8 hours. And this is because while you have high amounts of adenosine creating the sleep pressure, your circadian rhythm is telling you it's daytime, you should be awake now, which is also why jet lag is a thing. So while you may have high amounts of sleep pressure from being awake for a really long time, it could be bedtime in your new location, but your body clock is still on the time of the previous destination and thinks it's daytime. What I want to also add as part of this idea around circadian rhythm is a lot of this is genetic. And because of the genetics, there are those that have preferences for when they want to be going to bed. And so preferences for going to bed earlier or waking up earlier, or going to bed later and waking up later. And you've probably heard the expression of morning types or night types or larks and owls. This is fairly genetically predisposed. And the name for whether you are an early to bed person or a late to bed person is known as a chronotype. And there's actually a sleep specialist called Dr. Michael Brews or Bruez, who's done a fair bit of work on chronotypes. And rather than just 2 chronotypes, he breaks people into 4 different chronotypes, which he details in his book, The Power of When, which I have to admit I have not read, but I've heard him on podcasts before. And he talks about there being 4 different chronotypes that he categorizes as animals, so dolphins, lions, bears, and wolves. And what he talks about is that not only does your chronotype impact on your sleep preferences, it also then impacts on what time of day you are going to be most wakeful, when you're going to be best at doing deep work, when you're going to be best at exercising, etc. So he has a quiz that you can take, which is thepowerofwhenquiz.com, and you answer some questions, and then he emails you to say which chronotype you are. And I imagine if you buy his book, the quiz and answers are in there. And as I said, I haven't read the book. From what I've heard and seen online, I like some of his ideas, but not all of them. Some of it feels pretty diety, and a lot of it feels a little bit like horoscopes. So it's not perfect from my perspective, but when I did the test a handful of years ago and then got to read the results, it did describe or seemed to describe what I had already figured out about myself through self-awareness. So things like, I much prefer going to bed early and waking early. That I'm much more productive in the morning for certain tasks like writing. That if I'm going to do exercise, morning is my better time. That breakfast is my favorite meal, and that I wake up hungry. So for me, the test didn't actually lead to any changes because of the advice. It more just supported what I already knew about myself. There is another online test you can do, and this one is by the site Sleep Habits, and I will link to it in the show notes. And with these tests, and there's multiple ones you can do online, there is a degree of habit that can get in the way of these results. And what I mean by this is this normally trends in one direction, that people think that they should be going to bed later than actually is ideal for them. So there are many people who feel that they are night owls or later to bed people, but actually this is a habit rather than a genetic predisposition. And this is then an entrenched habit that can then skew how questions are answered. And I would say that this normally trends in one direction, because I think it is rare that if someone is truly a night owl and someone who needs to or has a genetic predisposition to going to bed later, but is taking themselves to bed at 9 p.m. It's much more likely that someone is predisposed or genetically predisposed to be an early bird or someone who needs to go to bed earlier, but yet they've got into a routine of going to bed later. And I should also note that circadian rhythm changes as we go through life stages. So, for example, infants and young children have a naturally much earlier circadian rhythm. So they go to bed earlier and they wake up earlier. And I'm not talking about newborns here, but more at the point at which once a child is having one long sleep throughout the night and maybe a nap during the day. And yes, in total, they're going to be sleeping a lot longer hours than adults. But even when this is taken into account, they go to bed earlier and wake up earlier. So going to sleep, say, somewhere between 6:30 and 8 p.m. and then waking somewhere between, 5 a.m. and 6 or 6:30 a.m. And then as kids get older, but before hitting adolescence, so someone who's 8, 9, 10, 11, that kind of thing, their sleeping becomes more like an adult whose preference is for being a morning person. But they're still needing more sleep than an adult. So their total sleep time decreases from when they were younger, but it also shifts so that they're going to bed a little later and waking a little later. So maybe going to bed at 8:30 or 9 p.m. and waking at 6 or 7 p.m. 6 or 7 a.m., sorry. But then in the teenage years, and especially the late teenage years, this is where things drastically change, where circadian rhythm shifts to being much later. So going to bed later and waking up later. And in Walker's book, he offers the potential evolutionary explanation for this is that this is coinciding with a time in a teenager or an adolescent's life where there's greater individuation. And so teenagers are then up later than the adults. And I actually remember this from my teenage days. I mentioned earlier that I'm definitely an early to bed and early to rise person. And for my teenage years, I did mostly keep this up, but that was probably because I was having to get up at 5:30 a.m. to get to school on time. But I do remember in the holidays in my final year of school, when I was studying for my final exams, that my best studying would be done between about 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. This is when I was most focused. This is when I was most productive. I would then go to bed after that and probably wake up around 10 a.m. or 10:30 a.m. And this had never been my pattern before, but because of the changes that were then happening as part of adolescence and changes that then occur because of the circadian rhythm, I became a night person. And this then makes school starting times for teenagers a real issue. And interestingly, like some statistics around this, like a century ago, schools in the US started at 9 a.m. And now 80% of schools in the US start before 8:15 a.m. and 50% start before 7:20 a.m. And what this typically means is that teenagers are getting much less sleep than they ideally should, and also waking up much earlier than they ideally should. And this means that they're missing out on a lot of sleep and a lot of REM sleep, which I will touch on in a little while. And they've actually done pilot studies around this where they started school time later, and this was the only thing that they changed. And this alone created higher test scores. And I think the same way about adults as well, who are truly night owls. Like, the world of work is changing, but it is still largely set up for those who go to bed early and wake up early. And so if your chronotype isn't set this way, the inadvertent consequences of having to get up earlier than ideally your body would like to is really huge. And there is a connection between mental health issues with many of these beginning in teenage years and having to get up earlier. And while insufficient sleep may not be the only cause or the primary cause, it makes it much more likely or more severe. Starting school later also leads to less fatalities by fewer car accidents. And I think this is applicable to teenagers who are new to driving, but is also applicable for all drivers. So one of the most eye-opening parts of the book is the statistics around sleep and our driving ability. So this can be viewed from two angles. So the first is how long you've been awake for. So once you've been awake for more than 15 hours, your ability to operate a car just nosedives, which means if you woke up at 6 a.m., by 9 p.m., it's become much more dangerous for you to be behind the wheel. And by 19 hours of being awake, so if you woke up at 6 a.m., by 11 p.m., you are as cognitively impaired as someone who is legally drunk. So the other angle that you can explore this from is looking at limited sleep and how, if you've had limited sleep and then drive, how this impacts on things. So if you've had between 5 and 6 hours sleep, you're nearly double as likely to have a crash. If you've had between 4 and 5 hours sleep, you are over 4 times as likely to have a crash. And if you get under 4 hours sleep and then drive, you are 11 times more likely to have a crash. And if you've had less than 4 hours sleep, or you've had 8 hours sleep but are legally drunk, your chance of having a car accident are the same. And so I read those statistics and I think of all new parents driving out of a hospital with their new child, and they're probably the equivalent of being legally drunk at a time when they have this new precious human in the car and they just want to protect it. If you combine having less than 4 hours sleep and also being legally drunk, then the chance of an accident is 30 times more likely. So drink driving when combined with lack of sleep is way more of a problem than simply drink driving on its own. So for me, bring on driverless cars. But let's get back to the circadian rhythm changes throughout life. So I mentioned that as a teenager, I was most productive between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And I had this spell where that was going on. And I know if I tried to do that now, I would find it impossible. But this just happened because of the developmental state that I was in. And I'm not sure at what point this then regressed to a more reasonable time. I know by 21, when I moved to the UK, I was definitely more of an early to bed type during the week. And yes, if I was going out, I would stay up later on weekends and was deprived myself of much needed sleep. But during the week, I would be taking myself to bed before or by 10 p.m. each night. And on weekends, if I wasn't out, my weekends were the same as my weekdays. And so this is what then happens in adulthood, where we settle into a circadian rhythm, and then you have that chronotype for your adult life. And that's then until you hit older age. And then in older age, you have a tendency again for circadian rhythm to become earlier. So you're going to bed earlier and you're rising earlier. But yeah, so that is the circadian rhythm throughout different life stages. But if there's anything that I want you to take from this section, it's that we all have a chronotype that we are genetically predisposed to, and that this dictates, in an ideal world, when we should be doing our sleeping. So before I jump into the actual process of sleep and what's going on, I want to define sleep health. So how do we know if we're getting enough sleep or if the quality of our sleep is good enough? And this isn't actually so easy to subjectively know. Like when we are sleep deprived, we never notice how much of an impairment this is causing. So I bet you've driven home after being awake for 19 hours and didn't feel like you were legally drunk. So our subjective ability to rate how much we are sleep deprived or if we are getting enough sleep isn't the greatest. And obviously you can go and do a sleep study where they can look at how much sleep you get across a night and you're wired up. So they look at your brainwave activity, they can see how much time you're spending in the different stages of sleep and compare this to what is recommended. But even with this, it's not answering the question around sleep debt, as it's just looking at that night. And the other issues with this is that people can sleep worse if they are in a room that they're not used to being in and if they're hooked up to machines. I know that there are now sleep studies that you can do at home where they give you a device that you set up to monitor all this. But the reality is for most people, they're just not going to do this unless they think there is something untoward that needs to be looked at. So this means that we're typically reliant on various signs and symptoms to estimate what sleep quality is like and to determine how well we're doing from a sleep health perspective. So in Walker's book, he talks about two easy indicators that tell you are not getting enough sleep. And there can be much more subtle signs of sleep debt or poor sleep. But if either of these two are happening, it's a fairly clear sign. So the two questions are, like, after waking in the morning, could you fall asleep again at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m.? And the other question is, you can't function optimally without caffeine before noon. And so if you answer yes to either of those questions, then you're not getting enough sleep. And there's also a paper that addresses sleep health in much more detail. So it's called Sleep Health, Can We Define It? Doesn't Matter. And I've linked to it in the show notes. So what I want to do is just use the definition of sleep health from this paper. So they define it as a, quote, multidimensional pattern of sleep wakefulness adapted to individual, social, and environmental demands that promote physical and mental well-being. Good sleep health is characterized by subjective satisfaction, appropriate timing, adequate duration, high efficiency, and sustained alertness during waking hours, end quote. So as part of this definition around sleep health, they point to 5 dimensions that appear relevant when we're looking at this to try and define it and trying to measure it, especially if we're trying to do that at a population level. So dimension 1 is sleep duration. And this is the total amount of sleep obtained per 24 hours. And while people will differ in their needs, Walker typically advises to get a minimum of 8 hours sleep. As part of the paper, and the question as part of this paper for duration of sleep, they asked, are you getting between 6 and 8 hours a night? But I'd say based on the book, this is probably lower than should be recommended. As a side note, there's also a difference between actual sleep time and sleep potential. So for example, if you go to bed at 11 p.m. and you have to be up at 7 a.m., you've given yourself a maximum sleep opportunity of 8 hours. But if it takes you 20 minutes to fall asleep after getting into bed, then your actual sleep time is 7 hours, 40 minutes. So when figuring out sleep duration, this needs to be taken into consideration. And if you actually need 8 hours of sleeping time, you need to give yourself a sleep opportunity that is longer than this because of the time it takes to fall asleep and or the time that you will then awake in the night if this happens. Okay, back to the 5 dimensions. So number 2 is sleep continuity or efficiency, which is the ease of falling asleep and returning to sleep. So the question with the paper for this one is, do you spend less than 30 minutes awake in the night? And this includes the time to fall asleep and the awakening from sleep. And it takes a while for the mind to shift into sleep mode. So anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes is a normal amount of time to be awake and then going to sleep. Any less than about 10 minutes could be an indication you're in need of going to bed earlier or you are sleep deprived. Any longer than 30 minutes, and it could point towards something else that we will, and I will deal with some of these when we look at the sleep recommendations and some of the things that could be getting in the way of someone falling to sleep easier. It's also worth noting that it is completely normal to wake for brief moments throughout the night. So as I'm going to talk about in a little while, throughout the night we go through sleep cycles, and between some of these cycles, it's common to wake up briefly before going back to sleep. So just because you remember waking a handful of times in the night doesn't mean there's an issue or you're sleeping badly. If these are brief moments of awake time and it's easy getting back to sleep, then this is completely normal as part of good quality sleep. So dimension 3 is timing. So the placement of sleep between or within the 24-hour day. And as I talked about earlier, our body has a circadian rhythm that we're meant to follow. And some of this is dictated by our genetics, but it's also impacted upon by the zeitgebers like light and dark and food intake and movement and social interactions and other factors that nudge and tell the body what time it is. The question asked for this one in the paper is, are you asleep or trying to sleep between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m.? And the reason for asking about this specific time is regardless of whether you are genetically wired to be an early to bed person or a late to bed person, biologically between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. we should all be sleeping. During part 2 of this podcast, I'm going to make some recommendations with sleep timing, so we'll come back to this one later on. But suffice to say that there are better metrics than simply looking at is someone asleep or attempting to be asleep between 2 and 4 a.m. to look at sleep timing. Dimension 4 is alertness and sleepiness, and this is the ability to maintain attentive wakefulness. The question in the paper for this one is, do you stay awake all day without dozing? Now, obviously, there are cultures where they have a siesta or a nap during the day, and this is fine. And there's actually some solid evidence that Walker talks about in his book about the benefits of this kind of a routine. So this question is more talking about dozing throughout the daytime when the intention isn't to be having a nap, and where a nap isn't part of your routine. And then the final dimension, the 5th dimension, is satisfaction or quality. And this is a subjective assessment of good or poor sleep. So all the questions up to this point had been quantifiable. They were yes, no questions based on whether you were inside or outside of some parameter. But this final question is subjective as it asks, like, are you satisfied with your sleep? So those are the 5 categories that this paper looked at in terms of sleep health, and with the suggestion that when we're trying to address sleep as a health indicator at a society level, that we focus on these metrics as a way of determining how we are doing. And obviously at an individual level, there are many questions that could be asked and there are many indicators that could be looked at, but based on like metrics for a population-wide sleep health scores, this is the starting place that this paper is recommending. And the paper did mention a potential 6th idea, which is sleep adaptability, which is defined as the ability to sleep well under conditions of physical, psychosocial, or chronobiological stress, which is something to consider. But it's one thing, because it is one thing to sleep well when life is going perfectly and everything is lining up with your sleep hygiene routine. But it's another if this doesn't happen, that it completely knocks you out of place and that you can't sleep under these kind of conditions. The problem with this as a potential parameter or dimension is the difficulty in how do you quantify this. As again, this would be subjective, and so there unsure about how to even start to measure this. So it was kind of a footnote rather than a six factor. So that is that paper and the idea of sleep health. So I now want to focus on what's going on when you are sleeping. And as part of, there are three sections here. So there's sleep cycles, then there's the difference between REM and non-REM sleep, and then finally the repair and function of sleep. So let's start with the sleep cycles. So throughout the night when sleeping, our body goes through 5 or 6 cycles, with each of the cycles lasting anywhere between 70 to 120 minutes. So Walker talks in his book about cycles being roughly 90 minutes, but there is research to show that this time varies among humans. So some people can be longer, some people can be shorter, and also that cycle length varies depending on the stage of night. So the first cycle at night can be different length to, say, your fourth cycle at night. And there's a great graph that I will link to in the show notes that visually makes this super easy to understand. It appears in an article called The Science of Sleep, Stages and Cycles. But given a podcast is an audio-only experience, let me explain it as best I can. So during each sleep cycle, you move through different brainwaves and sleep depth levels. So there are 2 broad sleep categories, REM sleep and non-REM sleep, where REM stands for rapid eye movement, and it gets its name from the moving of the eyelids that occur during this phase of sleep. So REM sleep is considered one category. And then within the non-REM sleep category, there are 4 different stages, which are cleverly labeled stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. And each of these stages relates to the depth of sleep. So stage 1 and stage 2 are lighter sleep, and then stage 3 and stage 4 are deeper sleep. So during each sleep cycle, which, as I said, lasts roughly 90 minutes, we move through these different stages. So we start with REM, then we work through all the non-REM stages, starting at 1, going all the way down to 4. Then we work back up, starting from stage 4, going all the way back up to stage 1, and then back into REM sleep. And then that is one cycle, and then we do it all again. But each cycle isn't a carbon copy of the one previously. So typically in the early part of the night, especially in the first 2 cycles, we are spending the vast majority of our time in non-REM sleep. And a lot of that is then deep sleep, so in stages 3 and 4. Then around the midpoint of the night, non-REM sleep and REM sleep are about even in how much time you spend in it for that cycle. And then as the night goes on and further cycles happen, you're more heavily weighted towards REM sleep. And when you're in non-REM sleep, it's more likely to be stage 1 or stage 2 rather than it being stage 3 or stage 4. And so with that graph that I talked about, you can see all of this as part of it. And as part of that graph as well, it includes brief times later in the night when going from one cycle to the next where you actually wake up, which is what I just mentioned earlier, that brief wake-ups a couple of times a night, especially in the second half of the night, are common and normal with healthy sleep. So for someone, this could be so short an amount of time that they won't even remember it, while for other people, they can wake up, they can roll over, are awake just long enough to know that it happened, and then they just drop off back to sleep again. And these cycles and how long your sleep cycles are and how many sleep cycles you need can be connected to how much sleep in total we need. And not just when you are sleep deprived or even outside of sleep deprivation, but how much you need on a regular night. So the length of your sleep cycle, whether that's 70 minutes or 90 minutes, when you then add them together will determine how much sleep you need. And same thing with how many cycles your body actually needs. Is it 5 cycles or is it 6 cycles? So just like your chronotype, these are going to have a strong genetic underpinning. So using myself as an example, I would consider myself a fairly healthy individual. And even when I'm doing all the things that are right and supporting myself, I do best on about 9 hours sleep a night. And this isn't me trying to catch up on sleep. This is simply what my body needs. And there could be someone else who is living in a very similar way and in a very similar state of health, and what they need is 7.5 hours or 8 hours. And these differences are at least in part connected to sleep cycle length and number of cycles per night. So the next thing I want to look at is REM and non-REM sleep and some of the differences that are occurring. So to start off with, let me just quote Walker from his book when he talks about this. Quote, "The wakeful state is about reception, which is experiencing and constantly learning the world around you. Non-REM sleep is about reflection, so storing and strengthening those raw ingredients of new facts and skills. And REM sleep is about integration, so interconnecting these raw ingredients with each other, with all past experiences, and in doing so, building ever more accurate model of how the world works, including innovative insights and problem-solving abilities." End quote. So if we use a gardening analogy, non-REM sleep is about putting in plants and pulling out weeds, while REM sleep is about the tending to what is maintaining and remaining in the garden and making it grow as best as it can. And if you look at brainwave activity of someone in non-REM sleep, it's very obvious that they are asleep, as it's just so different to wakefulness brain activity. But with REM sleep, it's actually very similar in terms of brainwave activity to being awake. And the big change being that motor skills are switched off when you're in REM sleep. So seconds before entering into REM sleep, you are paralyzed, you have no muscle tone. And this is because during this type of sleep, you are dreaming. And to avoid actually acting out your dreams, your body is paralyzed, though that those things are just confined to the mind. And throughout life, the percentage of non-REM to REM sleep changes. So as a newborn baby, it spends about 80% of their sleep time in REM sleep. By 4 months old, there's a pretty even mix, so 50-50 split between the two. By 5 years old, it's more like 70% non-REM sleep and 30% REM sleep. And then in late teens and adulthood, the non-REM sleep then ramps up further to about 80%. And this increase coincides with a huge amount of pruning that then goes on at this stage of life. So you've learned for the first 15 to 18 years of your life what the world is like based on your experiences. And then in your late teens and adulthood, then is when there's this pruning and getting rid of superfluous stuff that is no longer needed. And this is kind of where it stays, with non-REM sleep accounting for about 75 to 80% of sleep time, and REM sleep accounting for about 20 to 25% of sleep time. So if you're getting 8 hours sleep a night as an adult, about 6 to 6.5 of that's non-REM sleep, and about 1.5 to 2 hours of that is REM sleep. But as we just saw a moment ago, when we get our non-REM versus REM sleep isn't evenly distributed across the night. So the early part of the night is much more heavily weighted with non-REM sleep, with the latter part of the night being more about REM sleep. And this matters a lot, especially if you aren't getting enough sleep. And how this then affects you will connect in with the idea of chronotypes that we talked about earlier. So if you are someone who needs 8 hours sleep, but yet you're getting only 6 hours sleep, this isn't going to evenly affect REM and non-REM sleep. So if you get only 6 hours sleep and went to bed at the usual time, but you get up 2 hours early, then this is going to more drastically affect REM sleep, because that's when the majority of REM sleep takes place. If you get only 6 hours sleep and yet you went to bed later than you usually do and then got up at the normal time, then you will miss out on more of the non-REM sleep, because this was meant to happen in the earlier part of the night, where on this occasion you were still awake. Which is why total sleep time is important, but it's also important about when this is occurring. which ties back into my earlier comments about teenagers and having to get up so much earlier because of school than their chronotype would like them to. Like if you are missing out on sleep because of this, it's going to be the REM sleep that they're losing. And considering that REM sleep is about creativity and making connections to understand the world and how it works and their place in the world, it's a huge loss to then be missing out on this important chunk of sleep. So I now want to look at sleep as a whole rather than separating out REM and non-REM sleep to look at what are the functions of sleep. So how does sleep support our health? And the simplest way to generalize is sleep is all about repair. So it is when you are most active in turning over cells of bone and muscle and organ and tissues and replacing them with new cells. Our bodies are constantly in a state of catabolism and anabolism, and sleep is one of the most important times for this to happen. It is when your immune system is at its highest. Like if you've ever noticed that when you have the cold or the flu, that symptoms get worse at night, this is your immune system increasing, and it does a huge amount of work while you are asleep. So as a side note, while most people don't know it, you can actually die from a lack of sleep, and pretty quickly. In experiments with rats, if you totally sleep deprive a rat, it will die just as quickly as if it was from total food restriction. So on average, it takes 15 days. And the same is true with humans. Total sleep deprivation for an extended amount of time does result in death. And when they investigate why this is, the actual mechanism for death is septicemia. So which is an infection caused by large amounts of bacteria entering the bloodstream, and that in the case of extended sleep deprivation, because of the septicemia, it then leads to death. And this is because the immune system is so suppressed because of that sleep deprivation. And the World Health Organization has classified nighttime shift work as probably carcinogenic to humans. And again, this is because of the work the immune system is doing when we are asleep, or should be happening when we're asleep. Sleep is also the body's cleanup time. So throughout the day, during many normal healthy functions, substances are created that are damaging for the body. But by sleeping, the body then sends in the metaphorical cleanup crew and the bin lorries to remove all of these substances. So, for example, there is a connection between poor sleep and Alzheimer's disease. So in Alzheimer's, there is a building up of a substance called beta amyloid in the brain. And when sleep is happening in the right amount and the cleanup process is happening, it helps to then go in and remove these substances on a daily basis. But if sleep is not occurring as much as it should be, or it's disrupted, then this process isn't happening. And there are many factors that go into developing Alzheimer's disease and its prevention. And so I'm by no means saying that it is as simple as getting more sleep. But there is a connection between these two and many other conditions that arise because of the body's ineffectiveness in being able to clear substances that it should be getting rid of at the end of each day. Sleep affects our hunger signals and when we feel full, as well as the types of food that we crave. So it does this by affecting many different hormones, but let me just focus on two of them, so leptin and ghrelin. So leptin is a very powerful and influential hormone produced by fat cells, and it acts on receptors in the brain where it then inhibits appetite. So basically, it is a hormone that tells the brain whether or not you're hungry and then what the state of your fat stores are. And ghrelin is then another hormone to do with hunger, and ghrelin is secreted and produced by the stomach and the pancreas, and it increases before meals and then decreases after meals. So as such, higher levels of ghrelin increases food intake. And so it's been shown that those who are not getting adequate sleep are more likely to have decreased levels of leptin and increased levels of ghrelin. And what this means is that you're naturally hungrier and could need more food to feel full. And there was a podcast that I listened to that I will link to in the show notes that talked about this, and it was interviewing the head of a sleep lab who was doing research around how our food preferences change when getting less sleep than we need. And the research showed that people tended to serve themselves and subsequently eat larger portions. There was more of a craving for highly palatable food and calorie-dense food, and people's preferences for sweetness increased. So what they said was the right level of sweetness for them changed, and when they were more sleep deprived, they preferred those sweeter things. And just to clarify here, like in case this is all sounding diety, like I'm anti-diets, I'm a huge proponent of intuitive eating. But it's worth noting that by simply altering sleep, the amounts and the kinds of foods that you are driven towards can change. The podcast that did talk about this is rather diety and was fat phobic. So if you do want to listen to it, like please keep that in mind. But I did think it was interesting, the research that was looked at as part of that. Sleep is also crucial for sexual health and fertility. So sleep or poor sleep decreases libido. I talked about how poor sleep just then like decreases leptin levels. Well, leptin is useful also for reproduction. It's not just simply about hunger and fullness. So in women, it can impair ovulation, and in men, it can lead to decreased numbers and quality of sperm. But it's not just leptin, like sleep affects progesterone and estrogen and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone and testosterone and really all crucial hormones for reproduction. Sleep affects how we experience pain. So with less sleep, the more sensitive to pain we are. I could go on. Like basically, sleep is important for every system of the body, whether you are talking about cardiovascular health, blood sugar regulation, your nervous system, your ability to adequately respond to stress, like all of these are aided by sleep. And it's especially important for exercise and exercise recovery. And I've done a whole podcast on exercise that I recommend listening to if you haven't already, because I think as a society, we have some pretty warped views around exercise. But for exercise to truly enhance health, your body needs to adapt. And to adapt, it needs adequate food and it needs adequate rest. And without these two, exercise is simply a stress on the body. And when people talk about things like muscle memory and the ability to do a new sport or a new skill, this is also because of sleep. And there is a whole section in Walker's book about sleep and exercise, which is great, but let me just quote some of it. Quote, obtain anything less than 8 hours of sleep at night, and especially less than 6 hours a night, and the following happens. Time to physical exhaustion drops by 10 to 30%, and aerobic output is significantly reduced. Similar impairments are observed in limb extension, force, and vertical jump height, together with decrease in cardiovascular, metabolic, and respiratory capabilities that hamper an underslept body, including faster rates of lactic acid buildup, reduction in blood oxygen saturation, and converse increase in blood carbon dioxide, due in part to the reduction in the amount of air that the lungs can expire. Even the ability of the body to cool itself during physical exertion through sweating, a critical part of peak performance, is impaired by sleep loss, end quote. And all these changes lead to then a downturn in ability and the body's ability to cope and adapt. So the body is then just failing to adequately repair. And this might take a while for someone to notice. Like I've written articles before about how it's often when people are doing the things that are overtraining their body that they can be performing at their best. But at some point this drops off, and this is when things sort of noticeably go south. There's also a connection that sleep loss predicts injuries in athletes. And while the research was looking at athletes, the same would be true for people who train but don't think of themselves as athletes. So some of this is probably due to the lack of repair that then makes bones more brittle and likely to fracture, or tendons less resistant. But a big part is also the negative impact of sleep loss on coordination and motor skills. So you move in a way that makes injury more likely. So up until this point, I've mostly been focusing on the repair of the physical body through sleep. But sleep is also incredibly important for the mind. It's how you process the mental and emotional events of the day, and you refresh your mind for the day ahead. It assists your brain in piecing together unrelated ideas and memories, in creating connections that increase creativity and enhance performance and learning and memory. So sleep before learning refreshes our ability to make new memories. Sleep after learning helps to then save those memories. Sleep helps with attention. It leads to emotional rationality, where the opposite of this is that lack of sleep leads to emotional irrationality. Sleep also helps us to forget painful memories or parasitic memories. And to quote Walker, sleep is the nocturnal soothing balm that removes emotional sharp edges. And there's research around PTSD in sleep. So sleep should typically be a time of low stress, where the brain takes painful memories and is able to then tag them and process them correctly, so that when you wake up the next day, they are not so painful. And this can then, with a very painful memory, can take time, but through the process of sleep, especially with REM sleep, it means that you're able to get over that situation. Someone suffering with PTSD has excessively high levels of noradrenaline, and this occurs at nighttime as well as in the daytime. And because of this high amount of noradrenaline, it blocks the sufferer from entering and maintaining proper REM sleep. So while they're having nightmares and clearly dreaming, because of the adrenaline and the high emotions, the brain isn't able to tag and process the memory correctly. So the next time it is the next night, it is the same intensity, and then the next night, and it just stays at this level. It's like never being soothed and processed by sleep. So in an experiment, they gave patients suffering with PTSD a drug called prazosin, which lowers noradrenaline. And with time, the nightmares greatly reduced in frequency and symptoms improve. So this wasn't a panacea on its own and doesn't resolve PTSD on its own, but it helped to put the body in a state that sleep could help and do some of its healing. So sleep really is just crucial for all mental and cognitive function. And as I've mentioned a number of times, when we are sleep deprived, we just aren't very good at estimating how much of an impairment it is having. We are terrible at estimating how tiredness affects our ability to drive, but it equally affects our decision making and our mental function in all realms. So sleep is most simply the best thing that you can be doing for all the repair of our systems and to be supporting healthy functioning. So that actually brings this episode to a close. I hope that you now have a better understanding of sleep and how it works and why it's important. During the next episode, so part 2, I'm going to be going through various ideas to assist in creating good quality sleep and restorative sleep, and also talking about, for a lot of the clients that I see, what are the things that get in the way of making that sleep or restorative sleep happen. So that will be part 2. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we are currently taking on new clients. So if you are struggling with disordered eating or eating disorders or chronic dieting or body image or any of the topics that we cover as part of the show, then please get in contact. You can go to 7-health.com/help. So I will be back next week with part 2 of this podcast. Take care.